The call came on a Tuesday, which Elara Voss had always considered the most forgettable day of the week. Tuesdays had no ambition. They sat between the fresh start of Monday and the hopeful slope toward Friday, content to be exactly nothing. She was on her third cup of coffee and halfway through a commissioned watercolor of someone's golden retriever when her phone rang from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Voss," she said, tucking the phone between her ear and shoulder so her hands stayed free. She had a bad habit of working through calls she considered unimportant. The watercolor was not going well. She'd miscalculated the wash for the dog's coat, which had come out too orange, too bright, too alive in a way the actual dog, based on the reference photograph, had not been. She was trying to decide whether to salvage it or start again. "Miss Elara Voss?" The voice on the other end was male, measured, with an accent that layered itself strangely. American on the surface, something older and harder beneath. "Italian, maybe." She set down her brush. "Speaking. My name is Johnny Ferraro. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Dante Carullo. You came highly recommended." She had heard the name Carullo before. Most people in New York had, even if they didn't know exactly what it meant. It sat in the city the way granite sits in the earth. You didn't question why it was there. You simply understood it always had been and always would be. Her landlord had once mentioned it without meaning to, in connection with a building dispute 3 blocks over, and had then stopped himself mid-sentence the way people stop themselves when they realized they had said something they shouldn't. She had filed it away the way she filed away most things, as texture, as information about the world she moved through. "Recommended by whom?" she asked. A pause. "By people whose opinion Mr. Carullo trusts. He is looking for a portrait artist. A specific kind of portrait. Not a photograph, not a digital rendering. Oil on canvas. Traditional. He has seen your work at the Meridian Gallery exhibition last spring, and he finds it suitable." Elara set her brush down entirely now and looked around her studio. A converted loft in Bushwick that smelled permanently of linseed oil and turpentine, lit by 2 north-facing skylights she'd fought her landlord tooth and nail to keep uncovered. Suitable. She turned the word over like a stone. Not excellent. Not extraordinary. Suitable. The word of a man who had already made his decision and was simply filling in the remaining administrative steps. "I'd need to know more about the commission before I agree to anything," she said. "Size, medium, subject matter, timeline. The subject is Mr. Carullo himself. Full figure or 3/4, at his discretion once you meet. Standard oil on canvas, 60 by 48 inches. Timeline. He prefers the work completed within 8 weeks. Another pause, heavier this time. He is willing to pay $300,000 for the completed work, with a $50,000 retainer upon agreement. Elara said nothing for exactly 4 seconds, which was the amount of time it took her to ensure she had heard correctly and that her face, even alone in her studio, was not doing anything undignified. "I'll need to meet with him first," she said. "I don't paint anyone I haven't spoken to. The portrait requires understanding the subject. Of course, I will send a car on Thursday at 2 o'clock. Please dress appropriately." The line went dead before she could ask what appropriately meant to a man named Carullo. She spent Wednesday researching. The internet gave her what it always gave: fragments, half-truths, a mythology more than a biography. Dante Carullo, 51 years old. Born in New York to an Italian-American family with roots in Palermo going back 4 generations. His father, Edoardo Carullo, had been the kind of man whose name people lowered their voices to say. Edoardo was dead now, had been for 6 years, and Dante had inherited what Edoardo built with all the ceremony of a coronation and none of the celebration. She found a photograph from a profile piece in a business journal, 9 years old, in which a journalist had described Dante Carullo's office in a building in Midtown as deliberately minimal, a room that reveals nothing and gives nothing away, which is, one suspects, exactly the point. The journalist had gotten half a quote from him about real estate development and nothing else. The photograph accompanying the piece showed him looking slightly to the left of the camera, as if something more important were happening just outside the frame. What the internet would not say plainly, the city said between its teeth. The Carullo family was the oldest and most powerful of the 5 families, though even that designation was now considered outdated, a relic. The Carullos didn't operate like the old families anymore. They were legitimate enough on paper, real estate, shipping, private equity, and illegitimate enough everywhere else that no one dared say it too loudly. There were photographs. Not many, but a few. Dante Carullo at a charity gala 4 years ago, standing with a glass of wine he wasn't drinking, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Elara's rent for a year. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired with silver beginning at the temples. He was looking at the camera the way some people looked at things they had already decided to dismiss. His wife, Sofia Carullo née Greco, appeared in one photograph beside him. She was beautiful, dark-eyed, luminous, laughing at something off camera. The caption was dated 3 years ago. In it she wore a green dress and her hair was loose, and she was turned slightly away from the camera as if she'd been caught mid-conversation. And there was something about the way she stood beside him that suggested ease. The ease of a person who had decided not to be afraid of the things other people were afraid of. Elara searched Sofia's name separately. The results were different. Smaller, quieter, and then a single article from 18 months ago in a New York paper, buried deep in a regional section. Car accident on the Taconic State Parkway claims 1 life. Sofia Carullo, 38, wife of prominent New York businessman Dante Carullo, was pronounced dead at the scene. Police report no other vehicles were involved. 1 life. The phrasing itself seemed unjust, as if 1 life were a small thing, an easily absorbed subtraction. Elara closed her laptop and sat in the dark for a while. The car was a black Mercedes S-Class with tinted windows and a driver who introduced himself as Marco, and then said nothing else for the entire 40-minute ride from Bushwick to the Upper East Side. Elara spent the drive with her hands folded in her lap, watching Manhattan unspool outside the window, thinking about the particular quality of silence that certain people used as a statement of power. She had dressed carefully without dressing up. Black trousers, a good silk blouse, her 1 pair of shoes that were neither paint-stained nor falling apart. She carried her portfolio bag, which was worn leather and had been with her since graduate school, and would communicate, she hoped, that she was a person with a professional history, not someone auditioning. She was not, she had decided during the drive, going to pretend to be something she wasn't. If he wanted a painter who would defer to his taste and flatter his image and produce something suitable in the most convenient sense of the word, he had called the wrong person. The house on East 73rd Street was not a house in any conventional sense. It was a limestone townhouse of the old New York kind, 5 stories, with a facade that had the patient confidence of a building that had watched empires rise and fall and expected to outlast whatever came next. There were no visible cameras, but Elara understood they were there. The iron gate at the entrance moved inward before Marco had even pressed a button. And she was still looking at it when she heard the door open behind her. She turned. Dante Carullo was taller in person than the photographs suggested, which was a thing she hadn't expected. The photographs hadn't gotten his stillness right either. They had captured the surface of him, the good bones and the silver-touched hair and the dark, watchful eyes. But they had missed the quality he carried the way a structure carries its own weight, a sense of absolute internal silence. Not peace, silence. The difference between a room that is tranquil and a room from which all sound has been deliberately removed. He looked at her the way he had looked at the camera in that gala photograph, as if she were a thing he was categorizing, not a person he was meeting. She met his gaze without looking away, because she was a painter and she looked at things, and looking away would have told him something she didn't want him to know. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice matched the voice she'd constructed from research and instinct. Low, unhurried, touched with that layered accent that lived in his consonants. Mr. Carullo. She extended her hand, and he shook it without hesitation, though she noticed his grip lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not a moment longer. His hands were not a politician's hands. There were old scars she cataloged by habit, the painter's instinct to read a person's history through their body. A thin line across the first knuckle of his right index finger. A wider scar at the base of his left thumb, old enough to have faded to silver. Hands that had done things. Sit, he said, as if it were a neutral observation rather than an invitation. They sat across from each other. Johnny appeared with coffee, set it on the table, and disappeared. Elara wrapped her hands around the cup. You've done your research on me, Carullo said. It wasn't a question. I research all my subjects before I agree to paint them, she said. I also suspect you've done your research on me. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a reaction, but the ghost of one, like the surface of water when a stone passes close by without touching it. You're direct. I find it's more efficient. He reached across and took the portfolio bag from beside her chair, which she had not offered, and opened it without asking. Another statement of power, or simply a man so accustomed to taking what he wanted that the concept of asking had never fully developed. She watched him look through her work. His face gave her nothing. He studied each piece for exactly the amount of time it took to see it, turned the page, and moved on. No effect, no praise, no criticism. A man who had learned, or perhaps had always known, how to receive information without broadcasting his response to it. This one, he said, stopping at a portrait she had done 3 years ago, a commission for a family in Boston. The subject had been a patriarch, 80 years old, who had asked her explicitly to paint him the way he actually was rather than the way his family wanted to see him. He had sat for her for 4 weeks in a room that smelled of old wood and medication, and he had told her things, not his secrets, but the shape of his life, the weight of what he had built and what he had failed to build, the things he was proud of and the things he was not. She had painted all of it. His family had initially been unhappy with the result. The patriarch had wept when he saw it. What about it? She said. You saw him, Carullo said. He set the portfolio on the table and looked at her. You didn't flatter him. You didn't soften him. You painted what was there. That's what a portrait is supposed to do. Most painters disagree with you. He picked up his own coffee, black, she noticed, as if even his preferences had been stripped of anything unnecessary. That's why I'm talking to you, and not someone else. Elara leaned back slightly, studying him the way she always studied her subjects in the first meeting. Openly, unapologetically, which most people found unsettling. Carullo did not appear to find it unsettling. He met her gaze and held it with the same flatness he applied to everything else. She looked at a man who had constructed, out of whatever rubble trauma had left him, a perfect interior fortress. The architecture was impeccable, every window sealed, every door reinforced. She had seen grief before, had painted it, had lived it, but she had never seen grief that had been so completely converted into a material. He wore it now like concrete, load-bearing, invisible from a distance, essential to the structure it was part of. I'll take the commission, she said, but I have conditions. One dark eyebrow lifted a millimeter. Conditions? I work on my schedule, not yours. That means you make yourself available when I need you, not when it's convenient for your office. I require a minimum of 2 hours of sitting time per session, 3 times a week. I don't work from photographs. I paint from life, which means you'll need to be present and not conducting business during sessions. She paused, and I talk to my subjects. Not about your business, not about anything you don't want to discuss, but I talk, because it helps me understand what I'm painting. You don't have to answer anything, but I'll ask. He was quiet for a moment. The silence in this man, she thought, was not the silence of someone considering. It was the silence of someone who had decided and was simply allowing the pause to exist. Those conditions are acceptable, he said. Good. She picked up her coffee. Then we'll start Friday. As Marco drove her back to Bushwick through the late afternoon traffic, Elara looked at her sketchbook in her lap and tried to decide what it was she had just agreed to. Not the formal terms of it. Those were simple enough. The other thing. The thing she had seen in the room on East 73rd Street that she was going to have to find a way to put on a canvas 60 inches tall. She had painted difficult men before. She had painted a Supreme Court justice who had asked her not to make him look kind, because kindness, he said, was a thing people assigned to him against his will. She had painted a financier whose entire self-presentation was a performance so complete he had nearly lost the ability to drop it even in private. She had painted a former athlete in the last year of his life, when the body that had been his instrument had turned against him, and the painting had required her to see the man entirely apart from the thing that had defined him. But she had never painted anyone who had sealed themselves so completely against being seen. And she found, as Marco negotiated the evening traffic on the FDR, that the difficulty of it was not a deterrent. It was the reason. On Friday, she arrived at the townhouse at 9 in the morning. Marco let her in without being asked. Johnny showed her to a room on the 3rd floor that had been prepared, a high-backed chair placed near the tall windows overlooking the garden, good northern light flooding in gray-white and clean. Someone had moved a mahogany writing desk to create space. Elara was shown her own work table, a wide surface, good height, with a new easel standing beside it. She spent 40 minutes setting up before Carullo arrived. She mixed her palette, titanium white, ivory black, raw umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, cadmium red, ultramarine blue, and prepared her canvas, toning it with a warm ground of diluted raw umber so that the white wouldn't fight her through the initial layers. She set 2 brushes out, a wide filbert for blocking in and a smaller round for the work that required precision. She looked at the prepared room, the light, the chair, the blank canvas, and felt the specific anticipatory quality she always felt at the beginning of a new portrait, which was somewhere between excitement and dread, because she never knew, at this stage, what she was going to find. When Carullo entered, he was dressed as she'd expected. Dark suit, this one charcoal with an almost invisible pinstripe, no tie, the collar of his shirt opened by exactly 1 button. He looked at the setup without expression and moved to the chair near the window, as if he'd been told to report somewhere, and was doing so dutifully. "Is this where you want me?" he said. "Shift the chair 3 inches to the left. And angle it slightly. I want a 3/4 view, not a full profile." He adjusted without comment. She looked at him from across the room, then walked closer, tilted her head, looked again. The light was good. It caught the left side of his face and fell off along the jaw and the throat, leaving the right side in a graduated shadow that would give the painting depth. She could already see, in the abstract geometry of light and dark, the formal possibilities. "May I?" She gestured toward his position, his posture, and he made a small, permissive gesture. She moved his shoulders slightly, adjusted the angle of his jaw with a cupped hand that barely touched him. He didn't flinch, didn't tense. It was like adjusting a statue. "Good. Stay like that for now." She returned to her easel and began. The first session was almost entirely silent. She blocked in the large shapes, the dark mass of his suit, the architecture of his shoulders, the rectangle of light catching the side of his face. She wasn't painting details yet. She was learning the geography, the way the light fell and split across the planes of his face, the particular heaviness that sat in his brow, not a scowl, not a frown, just weight. Structural, the way his hands rested on the arms of the chair, neither relaxed nor tense, but held, consciously placed. She had a theory about hands. You could learn more about a person's inner life from how they held their hands at rest than from almost anything else. Loose hands belonged to people who were genuinely at ease in the world or who had learned to perform ease convincingly. Tight hands, white knuckles, curled fingers, belonged to people under immediate stress. But the most revealing hands were the middle kind, held, deliberately arranged, belonging to people who were aware of their hands at all times and had decided what they should be doing. Carullo's hands were held. At the 50-minute mark, she said, without looking up from the canvas, "How long has the painting above your fireplace been missing?" A pause. She kept working. "For months," he said. "What was it?" "A family portrait. My wife and I, from our first year of marriage." She set down her brush and picked up a smaller one without altering her rhythm. "Did you move it or have it moved?" "I had it moved." "To where?" "Storage." The word landed like a period. Hard. Final. She let it sit. Her brush moved. But the structure underneath, the way he held his body, was a kind of argument. Every line of him said, "I do not require anything from you, or from anyone. I have organized myself to need nothing." She had painted people like that before, but not often. Usually it was older men, men who had survived something decades ago and had built their entire identity around the survival. Carullo was not old. He was in the middle of his life, which made the fortification more striking, like finding a castle still occupied, gates sealed, drawbridge up, in the middle of a country at peace. "Do you have siblings?" she asked, without preamble, as she began working on the tonal relationships of the background. He was sitting in the same chair, in the same position. She had marked the chair's location with small pieces of tape on the floor so nothing shifted between sessions. "A brother," he said. "Matteo. He lives in Rome." "Older or younger?" "Younger. By 4 years." "Are you close?" "We speak." He paused. "Occasionally." She translated this without asking for clarification. She had learned already that Carullo's silences were not evasions, but compressions. He gave you the least he could and trusted you to understand that the rest was there, simply sealed away. "Did he come when your wife died?" she asked. The quality of the silence changed. She kept her brush moving, kept her eyes on the canvas, and felt the change rather than saw it. A slight increase in the density of the air, the way a room's atmosphere shifts when someone in it experiences something involuntarily. "For the funeral," he said. "He stayed 3 days. And after that, life continued," he said. The phrase was not cruel. It was simply accurate, the way a fact is accurate, indifferent to whether you wanted it to be true. She looked up at him then, because something in the way he had said it required seeing his face. He was looking at her directly, and she saw, in the fraction of a second before he reassembled his expression, something that she had suspected but not confirmed. The fortification was not solid all the way through. There were places where the wall had been built over damage rather than through it. The damage was still there, underneath. It was holding up the wall from inside the way rock can hold a structure together until suddenly it doesn't. She looked back at her canvas. She picked up her brush and worked on the shadow beneath his jaw, the place where his neck met his collar, the small private geometry of a man's throat. "Tell me about her," she said quietly. "Only what you want." He said nothing for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. She didn't push. She kept working. The city made its noise outside the window, a distant siren, the percussion of traffic, the indifferent sound of 10 million people living their ordinary lives. "She laughed at everything," he said finally. His voice was the same, even, controlled, but there was a thread in it, very thin, like a wire under enormous tension. She had a way of finding something ridiculous in the things everyone else treated seriously. "I used to find it," he stopped. "I used to find it irritating. I understand now that it was the thing I could least afford to lose." Elara said nothing. She mixed a small amount of white into the highlight on his cheekbone, lightened it by a degree, and worked it in with the edge of her brush. She made everything. He stopped again, and this time the stop was harder, more deliberate, the way a man grips a surface to keep from slipping. "Bearable," he said finally. Elara set her brush down after a moment. She looked at what she had so far. A man in a chair, the bones of a portrait, the promise of something that wasn't finished yet. It was too early to see what it would become, but she knew what she was reaching for. The painting she wanted to make would not lie about him. It would not be kind in the comfortable sense, but it would see him, the whole of him, including the parts he had decided no one was allowed to see. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me that." He looked at her. "You're thanking me?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because you didn't have to, and you did anyway." He considered her for a moment with those watchful dark eyes, and she had the sense of something shifting, not dramatically, not visibly, but structurally. The way a building shifts in its foundation, imperceptible from the outside, but real. "It doesn't change anything," he said. "I know," she said. "It doesn't have to." She thought about him on the subway home. This was not unusual. She always thought about her subjects between sessions, because painting was not only the act of putting brush to canvas. It was everything that happened in between. The processing, the looking at what she'd seen and trying to understand what it meant for the work. What she thought about was this. Dante Carullo had organized his grief the way a general organizes a defense. There were protocols. There was structure. There was a hierarchy of what he allowed himself to feel and when, and she suspected the answer was never, or if ever, only in absolute privacy, in whatever small hours his discipline failed him. The fortress was not cruelty. She was certain of that. It was survival architecture. It was what a person builds when they have concluded, rightly or wrongly, that to feel the full weight of what happened would be to cease functioning, and they have too many things they cannot afford to stop doing. She pulled out her sketchbook on the train and drew from memory his hands, the particular set of his jaw, the small vertical line between his brows that deepened not when he was angry, but when he was thinking. She drew the blank space above his fireplace. She drew the way he held his coffee cup, like a man who had been told to hold a coffee cup and was performing the action correctly without the action meaning anything to him. She drew Sophia, too, from the one photograph she'd found. A woman laughing at something off camera, beautiful and alive in the way that only photographs of the dead can show you. Frozen in a specific second that the camera chose, and the camera had chosen one where she had been entirely herself. Elara had lost people too. Her mother, 7 years ago. A best friend from art school the year after that. Loss was not foreign to her. But she had processed it differently. Loudly, messily, with paint and tears and long terrible nights when she'd made work she'd later had to burn. She'd come through it differently. She wondered if there was a right way and suspected there wasn't. There was only the way you could manage, and the question of whether the way you managed left you intact enough to eventually put the weight down. She looked at her drawings of him on the train and thought, he has never put any of it down. He doesn't know how. The following morning, she went to her studio early, before the light got complicated, and stood in front of the study canvas she'd prepared for the compositional work. A smaller canvas, 24 by 18, on which she was working out the formal decisions before committing them to the 60 by 48. She had roughed in the large shapes, the chair, the figure, the vertical line of the window behind him, the quality of the light. She stood looking at it with her arms crossed and a cup of coffee in her hand that was going cold. What she was trying to solve was the question of interiority. How do you paint the inside of a person who has sealed himself so completely that the outside shows nothing? You can't paint what isn't visible, but you can paint the shape of the sealed thing, the outline of the absence. The way the walls of a container are not the container itself, but are the evidence that there is something inside. She thought about the Italian Renaissance painters she had mentioned in her research notes, the ones who had believed, genuinely believed, that a skilled portraitist could capture the soul of their subject. She had always been skeptical of the metaphysical version of this idea, but she believed in the practical version, that sustained and careful attention to a person, over time, in conditions of relative intimacy, reveals truths about them that other methods cannot reach. You cannot photograph the inside of a person. You cannot interview it out of them. But you can sit with them, look at them, and wait. She was going to have to wait Carullo out. She was going to have to be patient in a way that the Commission's 8-week timeline made formally difficult but not impossible. She was going to have to let him come to her. By the third week, she had moved from blocking to development, building the portrait layer by layer in the traditional manner, transparent glazes over the initial lay-in, building depth gradually, letting each layer dry before adding the next. The painting was beginning to look like someone, though it wasn't finished looking like him yet. That would come. She had also begun to understand his rhythms. He arrived precisely when he said he would, not a minute early, not a minute late, as if he controlled time by personal agreement. He sat without complaint and held his position with the patience of a man who had learned to wait for things without letting the waiting cost him anything. He drank his coffee. He answered her questions, usually. She had stopped treating the sessions as interrogations and started treating them as conversations, which made them more productive for the painting and also, she suspected, more bearable for him. She talked sometimes about her own work, the mechanics of what she was doing, why she had made a particular color choice or compositional decision. He listened. He did not pretend to be interested, and he did not pretend not to be. He simply listened, the way someone listens who has grown and used to being talked to, as if their opinion mattered. The Italian Renaissance painters, she said one afternoon, working on the deep shadow inside his jacket's lapel, believed that the soul of a person was literally present in a good portrait. Not metaphorically, they meant it physically. They thought a skilled painter could capture something essential that the sitter actually left behind. And you, he said, do you believe that? She considered. I believe that people reveal things when they're sitting still and quiet, and someone is looking at them very carefully. Whether that's the soul, she shrugged. I'll leave that to the theologians. But there's something there. Something that isn't just shape and light. What do you see when you're looking at me? He said. Not challenging. Not guarded. Genuinely asking, which surprised her. It was the most unguarded thing he had asked yet. She set her brush down and looked at him straight on, the way she did when she needed to really see. He let her. He sat there in the winter light and let himself be looked at without flinching or deflecting, and she understood that it cost him something, this allowing. I see a man who built himself very carefully, she said. After something broke him, I see the building. I can also see the break, not what it looks like, but where it is. The shape of the absence. He was quiet for a long moment. That sounds like a flaw. It sounds like a human being, she said. There's a difference. He looked at his hands, not at her, not at the canvas, at his own hands in his lap. Architects say a building that has never settled has never been tested, he said. The cracks are what prove it stood up under weight. She looked at him, surprised not by the thought, but by the fact that he'd offered it, something that cost him something, given back to her in kind. Yes, she said. Exactly that. The following session she arrived to find the room slightly rearranged. Johnny had moved the work table 6 inches to the right, apparently in response to a complaint she hadn't made, and the adjustment was actually better. She said nothing about it. She sat up, mixed her palette, and waited. When Carullo came in that day, he was on the phone. She heard the call end as he reached the door, heard him say, very quietly, in Italian, something that she caught the last word of, enough. He came in, sat down, adjusted himself to the taped position, and said nothing. She began working. After about 20 minutes, she said, You speak Italian with your staff. Some of them. Did you grow up speaking it? My mother spoke it at home. My father used it when he was angry. A pause. Or when he didn't want the staff to understand him. What do you use it for? He was quiet for a moment. When I need to say something true, he said. It seemed to surprise him slightly, the thing he'd said. She saw his jaw shift minutely, as if he were recalibrating. I hadn't considered that before. She filed it away. A man who used his mother tongue as a private channel for truth. She thought about what that said about the language he used the rest of the time, and what it said about the territory she was trying to paint. It happened at the end of the 4th week, on a Thursday afternoon that had started ordinarily enough. She had been working on his eyes, the most difficult part, always, because the eyes in a portrait carried the emotional truth of the whole work. when Johnny appeared at the door with a look that was controlled but not quite neutral. "Mr. Carullo, there's a situation." Carullo stood immediately, with the specific kind of readiness that comes from years of being the person all situations are brought to. He looked at Elara. "Excuse me." Of course. He was gone for 20 minutes. She kept working. She was in the middle of a passage, and stopping felt wrong. But she was also listening to the sounds from the hall. Raised voices, at one point, though not Carullo's. His voice, when she heard it, was lower than the others, almost quiet, which she had come to understand was more dangerous than shouting. A door closed. Silence. When he returned, something had changed in the set of his shoulders. Not visible, not dramatic. A photographer wouldn't have caught it. But she saw it the way she always saw things, in the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his hands, when he sat back in the chair, were not quite at rest. "We can stop for today if you need to," she began. "No," he said. "Continue." She looked at him for a moment, then returned to the canvas. She worked without speaking for a while, letting the room do what it needed to do. Outside, a car alarm went off and then stopped. The light shifted as a cloud moved. "Someone got hurt," she said finally. Not a question. He looked at her. "Why would you say that?" "Because of the way you came back into the room." He was quiet. "Then, one of my men. There was an altercation. He'll recover." "Were you?" "I was not there." A pause. "I am rarely directly involved in those things anymore." She understood what those things meant, in the context of who he was and what he ran. She was not naive about it. She had known going in. She understood that the money funding this portrait and the money that paid for this house and the complicated, layered infrastructure of his world was not clean money in any conventional sense, that there were acts of violence connected to it the way violence is always connected to power when the power is of a certain kind. She had made peace with that in her own way. She was not his confessor, not his judge. She was painting his portrait. She was trying to see him truly. These were not incompatible things. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "What I am?" She kept her brush moving. "What you are is my subject," she said. "I'm not here to evaluate your choices." "That's not what I asked." She stopped. She looked at him. He was watching her with that flat, careful attention, but there was something underneath it now, something that was actually asking, not performing the question, asking it. "Yes and no," she said honestly. "The violence bothers me in the abstract. Violence always does. But I don't know enough about your specific life to know what choices you had and what choices you didn't. People are rarely simply their worst things. Some people are. Are you?" He didn't answer. She returned to the eyes on the canvas, the left one, which she hadn't gotten right yet, which was darker and more guarded than the right, which was a detail she'd noticed in life and was determined to get right on canvas. "You could stop," he said. "The commission, if you found it compromised your—" "I finish what I start," she said. "And I find you worth painting." She said it the way she meant it, simply, practically, without sentiment. He heard it that way and was quiet, and she thought she saw. In the peripheral vision, she kept turned toward him even while she worked, something in his expression that was not quite relaxation but was adjacent to it, the way a fist does not open all at once, but can, sometimes, begin to. They worked in silence for another 40 minutes, and the session ended the way the sessions always ended. She cleaned her brushes. He stood and adjusted his jacket, and they said nothing meaningful by way of goodbye, which was itself a kind of meaning. But when she was gathering her things to leave and he was already at the door, he paused without turning around. "I appreciate that you stayed," he said. After the interruption, most people would have found a reason to leave. "I'm not most people," she said. He turned his head slightly, just enough that she could see the line of his profile, the jaw and the cheekbone in the late afternoon light. He did not say anything else. He went through the door. But she carried the small weight of the moment home with her on the subway. Pressed between her sketchbook and the memory of the left eye she'd finally started to get right. That evening she sat at her kitchen table in Bushwick with a glass of wine and her sketchbook, and tried to articulate to herself exactly what she was doing. Not professionally. She knew what she was doing professionally. Personally. She was building a relationship with a complicated man under a formal structure that had a clear end date. And she was doing it knowing that he was in no position to offer anything beyond what the formal structure contained. And she was doing it anyway, because she had been paying attention to him for 4 weeks, and the person she was paying attention to was someone she found. What was the word? Essential. Not in the romantic sense. Not yet. Perhaps never in any simple sense. Essential in the way that certain subjects are essential to a painter. Not chosen so much as recognized, discovered already necessary. She wrote in her sketchbook, "The subject is a man who has concluded that care is a liability. The work is to show him something different without telling him anything. The telling is his job, when he is ready. My job is to see." She underlined see. Then she closed the sketchbook and went to bed. She dreamed about him that week, which she noted with the detachment of someone who understood dreams as information rather than embarrassment. She was painting him in the dream, but the portrait kept changing. Each time she looked at the canvas, what she had painted was different. And each version showed something she hadn't managed yet in the real version. Grief, in one iteration, rage, in another, and finally, in the version she remembered most clearly on waking, something gentler. Something that looked like the beginning of wanting to come back. She made notes in her sketchbook in the morning, not about the dream, but about what the dream suggested for the work. The painting needed to hold more than it currently did. She was getting the structure right, the formal qualities, the likeness was there, the tonal relationships were working, the composition was sound. But a portrait that showed only what its subject chose to show was not a portrait at all. It was a very expensive photograph. She needed him to give her something he hadn't given yet. She thought about how to ask for it. She thought about asking directly. That was usually her preference. But something told her that with Carullo, directness was more likely to trigger the reinforced gates than to open them. What she needed was not a frontal approach. What she needed was weather. The right weather, inside the right moment. On the following Tuesday, she arrived to find something different about the house. She couldn't name it at first, a quality of the air, perhaps, or something about the way Marco met her at the door that was slightly less organized than usual. Upstairs, the room was prepared as always, but when Carullo came in, he was 8 minutes late, which was the first time in the commission that he had been late at all. He looked the same. He always looked the same. But she was learning to read him the way she read light, not by what it illuminated, but by how it fell, the angle, what it passed over without touching. "Bad morning," she said, picking up her palette. "There are no bad mornings," he said. It was such an obvious performance, of control, of imperviousness, that she almost laughed. Instead, she tilted her head. "Today would be," she said, "the anniversary of her death. Plus or minus a few days." He sat down in the chair very carefully. She kept her eyes on her palette. "How did you know that?" he said. "I looked it up." She picked up a brush. "I'm sorry. It seemed like something I should know, in terms of understanding the project." He said nothing. She looked up at him. His face was what it always was, composed, still, but his hands, she noticed, were not. The left one, resting on the arm of the chair, was working very slightly, the fingers pressing once and then releasing, once and then releasing, like a heartbeat. "We don't have to work today," she said. "I mean at this time." "I prefer to work," he said. "Sitting here in silence is preferable." She understood. It was preferable to whatever the alternative was in his head. She went back to the painting. They were quiet for a long time. She worked on the background, giving him space, not pushing. The painting was at the stage where everything she added would either deepen it or compromise it. She moved carefully. After a while he said, almost to himself, she used to hate silence. She had a specific thing she would do if a room got too quiet. She would start narrating. What she was looking at, what she was thinking about, what she thought the dog was thinking about. "We had a dog." He stopped. "I got rid of the dog after." "Where is it now?" I found it a good home. It deserved, he stopped again. It deserved someone who could take care of it properly. I was not in a position to do that. Elara thought about this. She thought about a man alone in a house from which he had systematically removed every evidence of love. The portrait, the dog, whatever else she hadn't seen or hadn't been told about. She thought about the particular cruelty of the thing he had done to himself in the name of managing the unmanageable. You were protecting it, she said. I was being practical. Mr. Carullo. She set her brush down. Dante. It was the first time she had used his first name, and she felt the air between them register it the way air registers a change in pressure. There's a difference between being practical and punishing yourself. I'm not sure you know which one you're doing. He looked at her. The careful eyes. The sealed face. And then, for the first time in the 4 weeks she had known him, she saw something move through his expression that he did not catch in time. Not sadness exactly, not grief exactly, but the large shapeless thing underneath both of those, the thing that doesn't have a name because we have decided not to give it one. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then it was gone. But she had seen it, and she knew now what the painting needed. On a Thursday morning, 2 days after the anniversary, he arrived at the session with something different in his bearing, a slight loosening that she had not seen before. She noticed it in the way he set his coffee down, less carefully, as if he had decided, somewhere between the 4th floor and the 3rd, not to be quite so precise about everything. She began work without commenting on it. Sophia used to say that I never arrived anywhere, he said, after they had been sitting for perhaps 30 minutes. She kept working. He was looking at the middle distance, which was his preferred mode of speech, addressing a space rather than a person, as if the words were less exposed that way. She said I was always there before I got there. Already decided. Already positioned. She said it was like trying to welcome someone into a room they had already furnished. Elara set down her brush and picked up another. Was she right? Completely. He was quiet for a moment. I told her it was efficiency. She told me it was fear. Who was correct? She usually was. About that kind of thing. He looked down at his hands. We met at a dinner. My father's house, not this house, his house in Connecticut. He used to hold dinners he stopped. For various people. Sophia's father had done business with mine. She was 26. I was 38. She came to dinner and sat across from me and said, within 10 minutes of meeting me, that I looked like someone who had never in his life eaten a meal that someone else chose. Elara looked up. What did you say? I said she was probably correct and asked if that was a problem. She said it depended on whether I was capable of it. He paused. I said I was, if the company was worth it. She said she'd reserve judgment. Elara smiled at her canvas. And was she capable of convincing you? She spent 13 years doing it, he said, with varying success. A pause. She took me to a restaurant in the West Village on our 3rd date that had no menu. You sat down, and they brought you what the kitchen had that day. I nearly left. I stayed because she looked at me in a specific way that I had already learned meant she was deciding whether I was worth her trouble. What did you eat? I have no idea. I couldn't tell you the name of a single dish. I can tell you that she laughed 3 times during that meal, and that on the 3rd time she reached across the table and covered my hand with hers and said, There. I knew from that moment. Elara put her brush down and looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was somewhere 13 years back, in a restaurant in the West Village, and she could see it. The thing she had been trying to locate in the painting, the thing underneath the concrete. There it was. How long after that until you were married? She said, quietly, not wanting to break the quality of the room. 2 years. She made me wait. A ghost of something crossed his face. She said she needed to know I could sustain something. That I wasn't only capable of intensity at the beginning. I told her I was a very patient man. She said that patience and sustainability were different qualities, and she intended to verify which one I had. And you were patient. I was. He looked up at her then. I had never worked harder for anything in my life. And I have, as you might imagine, worked hard for things. She went back to the painting. The left eye was coming into focus. She had been struggling with it for 2 sessions, unable to get the depth right, and now she understood the problem. She had been painting what she had known. She needed to paint what she was learning. She changed me, he said. Not with sentimentality. Factually, the way he reported everything. Not in the way people mean when they say that. Not the edges. She changed something at the center. She made me someone who wanted things for reasons other than strategy. Like the paint color, Elara said. Like the paint color, he said. Before Sophia, I would have said, the kitchen is adequate. The kitchen does not require changing. After her, I walked into that kitchen every morning for 2 years after she found that color, and I understood why she wanted to change it, and I kept thinking, there will be time for that. We will do that. He stopped. The last thing she said to me, on the phone that evening, was that she had found the exact measurement for the wall and was going to order the sample pot that week. She wanted to test it on the wall before committing. Elara set her brush down. She was being careful, she said, making sure it was right. Yes. That's not someone who was planning to stop. He looked at her. His eyes were very still. No, he said. It wasn't. She arrived early one Thursday to find Johnny in the third-floor room, adjusting the angle of the easel with a precision she recognized as belonging to a man who cared about details not for aesthetic reasons, but because details, in his world, were the difference between things working and things failing. He turned when he heard her, inclined his head, and made a small movement to step aside. Miss Voss, he gestured at the easel. The light was different this morning. The angle seemed. You were right to adjust it, she said. Thank you. He nodded. He was about to leave, as he always was. Johnny existed in the margins of rooms, present and then absent, his transitions so smooth they barely registered his movement. She had the impression that this was the result of decades of practice at being necessary without being noticed. Can I ask you something? She said. He paused. His face gave her very little. Of course. How long have you worked for him? 26 years. She was quiet for a moment, doing the math. He would have been with Dante from the beginning, or near enough. He would have been there through all of it. The transition from Eduardo's era to Dante's, the years of consolidation, Sophia, the accident, the 18 months since. 26 years was its own portrait of a man. You knew her, she said. Sophia. Something in Johnny's posture shifted. Not much, almost nothing. But she had been trained for 20 years to notice the almost nothing. I did, he said. What was she like? He was quiet for a long moment. She thought he might decline, might produce some graceful formula of professional discretion. But instead he looked at the middle distance. Not at her, not at the canvas, in the direction of the window, and said, she was very direct. She said what she meant. In this house, that was rare. A pause. She had no patience for the protocols. She learned what they were. She respected them because she was not foolish, but she found them unnecessary. She would come into a room full of men who had been trained to be careful, and she would simply say what she thought, and they would not quite know what to do with it. He found it. Johnny stopped, seemed to choose his next word carefully. Clarifying. He said once that she was the only person in his life who ever made him feel that the protocols were for other people, that they were not required between them. Elara looked at the canvas, at the roughed-in figure on it, the blocked-in face. And now, Johnny said, with a quality in his voice she couldn't quite categorize, something careful and truthful at once, the combination of a loyal man trying to be honest. He is very careful about everything. As he always was. Perhaps more so. He turned to look at her then, directly, for the first time in the conversation. You have been good for the sessions. I want you to know that. He is different, in a way that is not dramatic enough for me to describe, but real. I notice things. It's my job to notice things. I'm just painting a portrait, she said. Johnny gave her a look that was entirely professional and entirely saw through her. Yes, he said. Of course. And he left the room with the same seamless economy with which he did everything. And she stood with her arms folded in front of the canvas and thought about what 26 years of watching a man meant, and what Johnny had seen that he had not said, which she suspected was the more important half of what he'd told her. She mixed her palette with unusual care that morning, thinking about Sophia. She had been building a picture of her, not for the second portrait, which was weeks away, but for the first one. Because painting Dante required understanding Sophia, the way mapping a country's coastline requires understanding the sea that shaped it. Sophia had been the force that had, for 13 years, stood between Dante Carullo and the total completion of his fortress. She had been the one window he had left unsealed. And now the window was sealed from the outside by an event he had not chosen, and he did not know how to unseal it from within because the mechanism for opening was not something he had ever built on purpose. It had grown there, over 13 years of being allowed to grow. And now, she looked at the painting and painted his eyes, and she tried to put into them not just the grief but the memory of the window, the evidence of where the opening had been, and the fact that having been open once means the capacity for it is still there, even when everything appears sealed. She started over. Not entirely. The structural work, the blocking, the tonal underpinning, all of that was sound, and she kept it. But she scraped back the face and began it again, because now she knew what she was looking for, and the face she had painted was the face of a man in armor rather than the man inside it. They were not the same painting. She needed the second one. He watched her do it without commenting. She had explained what she was doing and why. Briefly, clinically, not asking permission but informing him as a courtesy. He nodded. "Does that happen often?" he asked. "When I'm working towards something I haven't fully understood yet." "Yes." She worked the palette knife across the surface, lifting the dried paint carefully. "It's not failure. It's more like refinement. In my business, starting over means you failed." "That's because your business is about outcomes," she said. "Mine is about process. The outcome matters, but if the process isn't right, the outcome will be hollow." She put down the knife and looked at the scraped canvas. A portrait that looks exactly like someone but doesn't feel like them is just a very accurate lie. He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to make me look," he started. "Honest," she said. "Is that a problem?" He turned it over. She watched him do it. "No," he said finally, and she believed him. The answer had cost him something, and he had paid it without flinching, which meant it was real. "Good," she said. "Then let's get to work." The next morning, alone in her Bushwick studio with the study canvas, she worked through the compositional problem she had been circling. She had been thinking about the great portraits of grief, not melodramatic grief, not performed grief, but the quiet kind. Velázquez, Philip IV in the later portraits, after 30 years of reign and the deaths of everyone he had loved. Rembrandt's self-portrait at 63, in the year before he died, broke and forgotten. Holbein's Thomas More. What those paintings had in common was not the expression of grief. They showed men who had made something of their suffering, not triumph over it, not peace, but integration. The grief had become part of the structure of the face rather than an emotion passing across it. That was what she was looking for. That was what Dante Carullo's face would show when she got it right. Not a man at the moment of loss, not a man still raw with it, but a man who had incorporated it, imperfectly, incompletely, but structurally, into who he was. The invitation came at the end of a session in the 6th week, offered without ceremony, in the same tone he used for everything. "Johnny will have dinner ready if you'd like to stay." She had meant to say no. She had a standing Tuesday evening commitment, a group crit she attended at a studio in Red Hook, other artists whose work she respected, a ritual she'd maintained for 6 years. She meant to say that, to cite the prior commitment, to leave things where they were, in the appropriate professional box she had been diligently keeping everything in. "All right," she said instead. The dining room was the least cold room in the house, which she suspected was not a coincidence. Someone had cared about it specifically. The table was a long dark wood, the kind that gets more beautiful with age, and there were candles, though they were not lit, and the chairs were upholstered in a deep burgundy that softened the geometry of the space. Elara sat across from Carullo at the near end of the table, which reduced the formal distance between them. The food was not restaurant food. It was home food, in the Italian way, dishes that took time and care. A broth with hand-rolled pasta, a braise that had been going since morning, bread that had the specific texture of something made by a person who'd made it the same way for decades. She said as much. "Johnny's wife cooks," he said. "She comes 3 times a week. Does she know she's a genius?" Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. It was too brief, too suppressed to be called that. but it was the nearest thing she'd seen. They talked about things that were not the portrait and not his past. The neighborhood, a gallery she mentioned that had recently shown work she admired, the history of the house itself. It had been built in 1897, he told her, by a banker who'd lost everything in the panic and sold it to Eduardo Carullo's father in 1924 for considerably less than it was worth. So it's always been your family's house, she said. I grew up in this house, he said. In that room on the 4th floor. He tilted his head upward, indicating somewhere above them. There are marks on the doorframe where my mother measured us. Mateo and me, every year. Are they still there? He looked at her. I assume so. I haven't looked in a long time. She didn't pursue it. She ate and let the silence do what good silence does, fill itself. Tell me something about Mateo, she said. He considered the request, which was unusual. He usually either answered or didn't. Deliberating was new. He's nothing like me, he said. He was always the one my mother could reason with. He went to university in Bologna and stayed. He teaches history. Medieval Italian history, specifically. A pause. He has never come back. He left the family business. There was no discussion. He was 17 when he told my father he was going to university. My father said nothing for 3 days. Then he said, go, if that's what you want. He never spoke about it again, in front of me. And privately? I don't know. My father and I did not have that kind of relationship. Elara looked at her wine. Do you resent Mateo for leaving? The pause was long. I resented it once, he said. When I was 25 and had just taken on responsibilities I had not chosen and could not refuse. I thought, he simply left. He decided the weight was not for him, and he put it down. He turned his wine glass once. I understand now that he paid for it differently. He has a smaller life. More, he searched for the word. Coherent. Mine is larger and considerably less so. Which would you choose if you could choose? He looked at her. The question was too direct. She knew that even as she asked it. But she had learned that sometimes the too direct question was the only one that reached him. I would choose Sophia, he said. Whatever came with her. Elara looked at her plate. She thought about what to say and decided that what she had to say was not useful, that there was no right time, that you couldn't schedule grief, that moving the line forever meant the weight only accumulated. He knew all of this. She was sure he knew it. Knowledge was not the problem. She reached for a different thread instead. Tell me about your father. Not who he was professionally. What he was like. Here, in this house. Dante was quiet for a long moment. The question, she could see, was one he hadn't been asked in a certain way before, or hadn't allowed himself to answer in this way, which were different problems with different solutions. He was formal, he said finally. Not cold, formal. There is a difference. Cold is the absence of warmth. Formal is warmth organized according to a protocol. He looked at his wine glass. He believed very strongly in the rituals of the house. Sunday dinner, always at 1 o'clock, always with the same dishes, always in this room. He said the rituals were what separated a family from a group of people who happened to live together. Did you agree with him? As a child, no. I found them, he considered the word, claustrophobic. As an adult, I understand what he was doing. He was building a container, something that would hold the family's shape even when everything outside was uncertain, which, in our circumstances, was often. And yet you've kept the rituals. He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise. I have, he said, to the extent that I can, alone. A pause that had something in it she hadn't heard from him before. A very small, very honest note of something that was not quite humor, but was adjacent to it. Johnny's wife comes Sunday at 1 o'clock. The dishes are not the same. My mother's recipes are, he stopped. Lost partly. My mother died when I was 31. But the time is the same. The room is the same. The container, Elara said. The container, he agreed. Without the things that were supposed to go in it. She looked at him across the table. The candles were lit now. She hadn't noticed when that had happened. And in the candlelight his face had a different quality than in the north-facing daylight of the third-floor room. Softer. More like the man she was beginning to know underneath the man he performed. What did your father think of Sophia? He was quiet for a moment. Then something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not the ghost smile she'd been cataloging since the first session, but something older and more complicated, an expression that contained several feelings at once. He adored her, he said, completely and immediately, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who adored things easily. But she called him Eduardo, from the beginning, not Signor Carullo, not by any title. She simply called him Eduardo, and the first time she did it, he looked at her the way you look at someone who has broken a rule that needed breaking. He paused. He told me afterward that she reminded him of my mother. I think that was the highest thing he could say about a person. And your mother, Elara said carefully. She died when you were 31. That was before Sophia. Yes, by 4 years. He picked up his wine, set it down without drinking. My mother was the center of things, in the way that certain people are the center of things without performing the role. You just know, without being told, that the warmth of a house comes from one specific point. When she died, the house changed. The rituals continued, but something had gone out of them. And then Sophia came in, Elara said quietly. He looked at her. And then Sophia came in, he confirmed, and lit things again. He said it simply, without drama, in the same, even register he used for the things that were most true, as if the things that cost the most needed the least ornamentation. Elara held it, the way you hold something you don't want to disturb by handling it too much. Sophia used to repaint the kitchen, he said, not quite out of nowhere. She had a specific color in mind. She found it in a shop in Trastevere when we were in Rome. She talked about it for 2 years. Did she ever do it? She kept saying there was time. He looked at his wine glass. He had not drunk from it in several minutes. There wasn't. Elara looked at him across the table, this man in his beautiful house full of elegant absences, and felt something that was not professional sympathy, but was something more personal, and therefore more dangerous, something she recognized, and had been very carefully not looking at directly for several weeks. She liked him. Not his money, not his mythology, not even his face. Though his face was extraordinary, she was an artist, and she could admit that much without complication. She liked the way he thought. She liked the architecture of how he spoke, the specific economy of it. The way he chose words, the way a surgeon chooses instruments. She liked the 2 seconds when the wall came down, and she saw the man underneath who was enormous with feeling he had nowhere to put. She was careful with the liking. She put it somewhere she could see it, but not pick it up, the way you set down something potentially dangerous and take a step back from it. There's always an unrealized thing, she said. Something that was going to happen later. Everyone has one. It doesn't mean you failed her. It means you were planning to keep going. He looked at her. Planning to keep going is not the same thing as keeping going. No, she said. But it meant you thought you had time. That's not a sin. That's faith in the future. It's one of the most human things there is. He was very quiet. She washed his hands on the table. One of them was doing the thing again, the faint press and release. She didn't say anything about it. I told myself I would grieve properly, he said, very quietly, after I had handled everything that needed to be handled. After the arrangements, after the business, after Matteo went back to Rome, after the house was quiet. I told myself I would allow it then. He stopped. I never found the right time. Because you kept moving the line, she said. Yes. And it's been 18 months. Yes. The painting, she said instead. When it's finished, do you know where you want to put it? He looked at her, surprised by the pivot. I hadn't thought about it. Think about it, she said. Because I think the portrait will need to go somewhere visible. I think that's part of why you commissioned it. Some part of you wants to put something back on the walls. He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. And for Carullo, she had learned, the absence of denial was its own kind of yes. It was late November now, and the garden behind the townhouse had the specific beauty of dormancy. Bare branches, the architecture of things revealed by the absence of foliage, everything stripped, to its essential structure. She had seen it from the third-floor window for weeks, and one afternoon she asked if she could see it up close. He walked with her. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected Johnny, or Marco, or the door just to be unlocked. But he came himself, still in his suit jacket, hands in his pockets, and they walked the long, narrow garden in the gray late afternoon. She noticed, without commenting on it, that he moved differently out here, less deliberate, the body slightly less managed. The open air seemed to give him permission. Sophia planted those, he said, gesturing toward a section near the south wall where the beds were more intricate, more intentional than the rest. She was not a gardener, but she read 3 books about it, and then she planted them anyway. That's what she did with things. A pause. Decided they were worth knowing about, learned them, and then did them. The roses, Elara said, looking at the canes, pruned back now, dormant. They'll come back. They've come back every year, he said. I kept the gardener. She looked at him. You kept the garden. He looked at the bare beds for a moment. She would have been angry if I hadn't, he said. And there it was, the ghost of something that was not quite a smile, not quite, but was the closest thing to it she had seen from him in 6 weeks. It appeared and then withdrew, like something that had briefly come out of the dark and then returned because the light was too much. Tell me something good about her, Elara said. Not something sad. Something that was only good. He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he might not answer, might put the wall back up. But he didn't. She sang, he said. Badly. She knew it was bad, and she did it anyway. Usually in the kitchen, usually early in the morning before she thought anyone was listening. Old songs, Neapolitan songs. The kind her grandmother had sung. She was completely off-key and entirely committed. Elara smiled. She couldn't help it. She caught me listening once, he said, and she didn't stop. She just got louder. Elara laughed. A real one, short but genuine. He looked at her, and she saw it again, that thing at the edge of his face. The ghost of the man he'd been before. Present for a second. She sounds wonderful, Elara said. She was, he said. Simple. Certain. The most direct thing he'd said to her about it, and she felt the weight of it. Not the sadness of it, but the fullness of it. He had loved this woman in a way that was still completely present 18 months after she was gone, still perfectly intact, preserved in amber under the concrete. Not diminished. Not over. Just sealed. That's why it's hard, she said. Isn't it? Not because the love is fading. Because it isn't. He looked at the garden. He said nothing, but she saw his jaw work. Once, and she understood. She didn't say anything else. They stood in the dormant garden in the gray light and watched the birds in the bare trees, and the city made its sound over the wall, and neither of them moved to go in. The cold was becoming real. She could feel it through her coat, but she did not want to break the quality of the moment, which was the closest to peace she had seen him hold. After a while he said, Sophia always said you could tell which plants were worth keeping by what they did in winter. The ones that just disappeared, they were decorative, she said. The ones worth having are the ones that hold their shape even when there's nothing to show for it. Elara looked at the bare rose canes, the stark architecture of them, purposeful even stripped of leaves. She was right, she said. She usually was, he said, and this time the ghost smile came and stayed a half-second longer than it had before. It rained that Thursday, which changed the light in the third-floor room from the clean gray she'd been working with to something warmer and more diffused. The silver light of a wet day, the city blurred through the glass, everything softer at the edges. She had not planned for this. She spent 15 minutes recalibrating her palette, adjusting the ratios, looking at the painting and the light alternately. He arrived and found her standing at the window looking out at the street below, where a man in a yellow raincoat was negotiating an enormous umbrella against the wind with the focused exasperation of someone for whom this was an unjust imposition. The light's wrong today, she said, without turning. Can you work in it? Yes. It'll just be different work. She turned from the window, and looked at him. He was in the door frame, jacket still on, an unusually small amount of rain on his shoulders. Marco must have managed the umbrella perfectly. Sit. I want to try something different today. Different how? I want you to hold something. She crossed to the work table, moved several jars, and came back with an object, a small antique compass in a dark leather case, which she carried everywhere in her bag the way some people carry lucky tokens, because she'd found it in a market in Amsterdam 11 years ago, and it had been the one purely impractical thing she'd allowed herself at a time when she couldn't afford impractical things. She held it out to him. He took it and turned it over in his hands. He opened the case, looked at the compass face, and glanced up at her. Why? Because empty hands look staged in a portrait. Your hands have always been the most interesting part of you. I want to see what they do with something to hold. He looked down at the compass. He turned it over again, closed the case, turned it over once more. His hands had a way of engaging with objects that was entirely unself-conscious. The only time they were, she'd noticed. When he was handling something, the held quality left them, the deliberate arrangement. They became simply hands that were interested in a thing. Sit the way you sat before, she said, and just hold it, however feels natural. He sat in the chair, settled himself, and held the compass in his right hand at rest on the arm of the chair. She looked at him from across the room and felt the click of something falling into place, the composition completing itself in a way she hadn't been able to achieve before. The compass was right. It wasn't the object itself, it was what the object did to his hands. She began working. After a while he said, "Did you always want to paint?" She kept her brush moving, pleased. He almost never initiated the conversation. "From when I was 7, she said. My mother took me to see the Vermeers at the Frick. I stood in front of the woman with a lute, and I thought I had never seen anything so." She searched for the word. "True. I mean that precisely. Not beautiful. True. Like something had been caught that I had never seen caught before. And you wanted to catch it too." "I wanted to try. I have been trying ever since." "Do you ever feel you've succeeded?" he asked. And the question was genuine. She could tell by now the difference between his rhetorical questions and his real ones. This was real. He was curious. "Occasionally," she said. Briefly. "The moment when I look at a painting and know it's finished and it is exactly what I was reaching for. That happens maybe 4 or 5 times in a career, if you're very good and very lucky. Most of the time you come close, and then you live with close. And this one." She looked at the canvas and at him. She mixed a small quantity of white into the highlight she was building on his right hand, the one holding the compass, and applied it with the edge of the brush. "I'm still finding out," she said honestly. "Ask me when it's finished." He turned the compass over once in his hand, a small unconscious motion. The rain was harder now against the windows. The light had settled into something she could use, not the light she'd planned on, but better in its way, more interior, more like the quality of the man. "My father had a compass," he said, "not unlike this one. He carried it always, in his breast pocket. I never knew why. He had no use for a compass. He spent almost all of his life in 3 square miles of Manhattan." A pause. "When he died, I found it in the pocket of the suit he'd been wearing the last day he was well. I tried to find a reason to keep it. I couldn't think of one that was practical." "So you gave it away?" "I put it in his coffin." He turned the compass over. It seemed like it wanted to be with him. Elara looked at her painting and did not say anything for a moment, because there was nothing to say that would improve on that. "That was a kind thing," she said finally. He shrugged, a very small gesture, the kind of denial that is also a private acknowledgement. He would have been irritated by it, he said. He had no patience for sentiment. A pause. "I find I don't care." She smiled at the canvas. The rain made its sound against the glass. His hands held the compass in the specific, unguarded way she had been waiting 5 weeks to see, and she painted them. December came, and with it the last 2 weeks of the commission. The painting was nearly finished. She could feel it the way she always felt a painting's end approaching, something settling in, the sense of a conversation reaching its natural conclusion. She had learned everything the painting needed to know. What remained was the execution, the final glazes, the highlights, the small decisive marks that would either complete it or ruin it, and there was no way to know which until she made them. The sessions had changed. Not dramatically. Nothing between them was dramatic, but in the way that small, consistent shifts accumulate into something different. He came to the sessions less defended now. He still arrived precisely on time and still wore the armor of his suit and the careful arrangement of his face. But he sat differently. He talked more. Not overly, not carelessly. Carullo was not a man who would ever be careless with words, but with less deliberate rationing. He told her things. She told him things. They had conversations that were not about the portrait, that were not about his grief, that were simply two people in a room learning each other. She learned that he read history obsessively, particularly Roman and Italian history, which she might have predicted. She learned that he had no patience for opera despite his heritage, but an unexpected and private love for jazz, and that the house had a sound system she hadn't known about because he kept it turned off during the day. She learned that he could cook one thing, a specific pasta his mother had taught him, and that he made it perhaps twice a year. She learned that he had not been to Italy in 3 years, not since the summer before Sophia died, and that this was connected to the fact that their last trip together had been to Rome, where they had visited the shop in Trastevere with the paint color. She learned these things the way you learn someone when you are paying the kind of attention to them that most relationships don't require and most people don't know how to give. She was paying it anyway. She had stopped examining the things she felt too carefully, because examination had a way of either inflating it or prematurely collapsing it, and she wanted neither. She knew what it was in the abstract. She knew it was inconvenient and complicated and probably unwise, and also that she was not doing anything about it and did not intend to, because she was a professional finishing a commission and he was a man still standing in the ruins of something catastrophic. She just kept seeing him, as clearly as she could, the painting and the person both. One afternoon in the second week of December, he arrived to find her working standing up, stepped back from the canvas, arms crossed, looking at the painting without touching it. She sometimes did this. She would work intensely and then stop completely, not because she was stuck, but because she needed to look from a distance and assess what the accumulated marks had produced. "Something wrong?" he said, taking his place in the chair. "No. Something right, actually. I'm looking at it." He turned to look at the painting. It was not unusual for him to look at it during sessions, though she had noticed early on that he preferred to look at it quickly and obliquely, the way you look at a bright light. "What do you see?" "I see that it's almost finished," she said. "And I see that it's honest." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that reassuring or alarming?" "That depends on how you feel about honesty." He settled back in the chair and looked at his hands. "Sophia used to say that I was honest about the wrong things, that I told the truth about facts and lied about feelings." She was observant. "She was," he said. "She would have found you interesting. She liked people who looked at things clearly." He paused. "She would probably have liked you a great deal, which I am aware is a strange thing to say to someone in your position, but it's true." Elara looked at him. "It's not strange," she said. "It's one of the kindest things anyone has said to me in a while." He looked at her then, with something that was not quite the wall and not quite the opening she had been hoping for, but was somewhere between, a door ajar. "You said she would have found you interesting. What do you think she would have made of you specifically? Not professionally. As a person." He considered this for a long time. "I think she would have asked you about your mother," he said finally. "She always asked people about their mothers. She said you could understand everything about a person if you understood their relationship to the first person who loved them." It was a Thursday in mid-December, 6 days before she planned to call the painting finished, when he asked her something she hadn't expected. He asked it during a break, when she was cleaning her brushes, and he had stood and walked to the window to look at the garden below. He asked it with his back to her, which she understood was deliberate. He was giving himself somewhere to look that was not her face. "When this is finished," he said, "do you take on New commissions. Immediately. Usually I take a few weeks between projects, she said. Why? A pause. He was looking at the garden. I would like to commission a second portrait. She set down the brush she was cleaning. Of whom? He didn't answer for a moment. Then, of her. Sophia. From photographs. He turned then and looked at her with the steady, deliberate attention he always used when he was saying something that cost him. I understand it's different from working from life. I have a great many photographs. I know which one I would choose. I've known for some time. I wanted to ask while he stopped. I wanted to ask you. She understood everything in the pause. He had waited to ask her because he had needed to trust her first, and he had needed to trust her first because this was not a commission in the ordinary sense. This was an act of recovery, the beginning of something he had been putting off for 18 months, the decision to stop erasing and start remembering. She looked at him across the room. The winter light was on him, the same light she'd been painting for weeks, and she saw him the way she had come to see him, not as armor and silence, but as both of those things and the man they protected, who was enormous with a grief he was finally, carefully, beginning to let himself name. Yes, she said. I'll do it. He nodded. The nod was not casual. It was the kind of nod that means, I've been carrying this particular thing a long way, and I'm putting it down now. I wanted to put something back on the wall, he said. You told me to think about it. I did. I remember, she said. The portrait of her, I wanted in the study, where the other one was. He looked at the window again. And mine, I think in here. In the room we've been working in. He looked around. The light, the easel, the space that had held there 8 weeks. It seems right. It is right, she said. She called the portrait finished on a Friday morning in the 3rd week of December during the last formal sitting. She could have decided it finished at any point in the previous 3 days. The painting was, by any technical measure, complete. But she needed to be certain, and certainty with a painting was a feeling more than a fact. She stepped back from the canvas and looked at it for a long time. It was good. She knew it the way you know something without vanity, not pride, but accuracy. It was the best work she had done. The painting showed a man in a chair near a window, 3/4 view, the winter light falling across the strong bones of his face. He was not smiling. He was not frowning. He was simply present, present in a way that most of his waking life, she suspected, he was not, because most of his waking life he was sealed behind the construction he had built. But the painting did not show the construction. It showed what was underneath. The grief was there. She had not softened it or hidden it, because it was real and it belonged to him and it had earned its place on the canvas. But so was something else, something that she had only seen in flashes, in the garden and at the dinner table and in the brief seconds when his face forgot what it was supposed to be doing. Something that, if she had to name it, she would call the capacity for return. He was looking at the painting. She watched him look at it. He was still for a long time. She counted to 40 in her head, which was the amount of time she normally gave someone in the first encounter with their own portrait before she asked for a response. He needed the full 40 and then some more beyond it. That's not what I look like, he said finally. It's what you look like to me, she said. He was quiet. He kept looking. She watched his hands, which were still at his sides, and the faint working motion was there, and she thought, he is trying very hard not to let this do what it is doing to him. He stopped. Tried again. You didn't, he stopped again. I didn't lie to you, she said. I promised you I wouldn't. He looked at her then, and she saw it full and unguarded for the first time. Not for 2 seconds, not briefly, but sustained. The door opened. The grief and the weight, and also, underneath it, the man who had loved his wife so completely that 18 months later it was still the most present fact about him, and who was, despite everything, still here. There is something I need to say, he said. All right. He moved, crossed the space between them in a way that was not quite slow and not quite fast, the way a man moves when he has decided something and is not permitting himself to change his mind. He stopped at a distance that was closer than professional and further than the distance people stand when they are about to do the reckless thing. I am aware, he said, very carefully, that what you have done here is a professional service, and that the commission ends today, and that I have no. He stopped, chose a different approach. You came into this house to paint a portrait. You have painted a portrait. That is the arrangement. Yes, she said. And yet, he looked at her. The controlled face, the watchful eyes, and underneath both of them the enormous reality of what he actually felt and had actually felt for longer than he'd allowed himself to examine. And yet I find that I have become, he paused for a very long time, accustomed to your presence. She held herself very still. Dante, I'm not asking you for anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. I understand that I am. He made a small gesture with his hand, indicating himself, his situation, the complexity of his life. I understand that I am not an easy thing. I'm saying only that you should know, that you should have the information. What you do with it is. Stop talking for a moment, she said. He stopped. She looked at him. The man she had been painting for 8 weeks. The man she had come to know in the particular way that paying very close attention to someone makes you know them. Not fully, not completely, but truly, in the parts that matter. The man who had kept the garden and gotten rid of the dog and removed everything from the walls except the ghost rectangles of their absence, and who was now standing in front of her telling her, in the most careful and controlled and thoroughly armored way possible, that she mattered to him. I'm not finished with you, she said. As a subject. His expression shifted. What? I've agreed to paint Sophia's portrait, which means I'll be here again. Which means, she took a breath. The commission ending today does not mean we're finished. The arrangement changed 8 weeks ago. You should know that too. He looked at her for a long moment. And then, slowly, carefully, like a man lowering the drawbridge he had not lowered in a very long time, something in his face opened. Not fully, not all at once. A crack of light. Then we're not finished, he said. No, she said. We're not. She came back in January, after the holidays, carrying the photograph he had chosen and the feeling of having spent 3 weeks in her Bushwick studio making work that had nothing to do with him and thinking about him anyway. The photograph was from their first year of marriage, which he had mentioned in the first session. Sophia at a restaurant table somewhere, laughing at something off to the right, her dark hair loose, a glass of wine in her hand, completely unposed and entirely herself. Elara had studied it for 2 weeks before she started. She'd made 47 preparatory sketches. She understood, looking at the photograph, exactly what she needed to do. She set up in the study this time, at his request. The space above the fireplace was still empty. She looked at it the first morning and felt the specific responsibility of what she was about to put there. He sat in the room with her while she worked, which was different from before. There was no subject in the chair, no formal arrangement, no 3 times a week schedule. He sat in the corner chair with a book or a report or simply his coffee, and she worked, and they talked or didn't talk as the work required. It was, she thought, the most intimate thing she had experienced in a long time. Not intimate the way touching is intimate, but intimate the way honesty is, the ongoing willingness to be in the same room as someone without performing anything. He brought her coffee at 9:30 without being asked, the first morning and every morning after. Not Johnny, himself. She noticed it the 3rd time it happened and said nothing about it, because some things are better received without comment. And she had learned that Dante Carullo expressed care through small precise acts rather than declarations, and the declarations, when they came, were the harder one thing. You're not painting her the way she looked in the photograph, he said one afternoon, after he had come around to look at the progress. No, she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the canvas. How are you painting her? The way you described her, she said. Laughing in the kitchen, off-key, getting louder. She looked at him. That's who she was. He looked at the painting for a long time. The figure was emerging from the ground in the way figures always did, gradually, as if coming out of something rather than being built from nothing. Sophia Carullo, or the beginning of her. The laugh lines. The specific joy. Yes, he said, very quietly. That's who she was. They fell into a new rhythm, the two of them. He was not a subject this time. There was no formal arrangement, no tape on the floor, no schedule. He was simply present, the way a person is present in a house they live in. She was working. He was there. They spoke when there was something worth saying. She found, in those days, that she was not thinking about the painting between sessions in the same way she always had before, not analyzing, not problem-solving. She was simply looking forward to returning. One afternoon she put her brushes down and looked at what she had. Sophia Carullo emerging from the canvas with a vividness that surprised even Elara, who had made it. The laugh lines around the eyes. The particular angle of the head, mid-laugh, that she had extrapolated from 100 small things Dante had told her. The green of her dress, a color she had chosen specifically, because he had mentioned it once, in the context of a dinner, as Sophia's favorite. "Come look," she said. He came. He stood beside her in front of the painting, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he looked at it for a long time. She hated being photographed, he said. She said photographs caught her in between things, that they never got the right moment. He paused. "You got the right moment. You gave me the right moment," she said. "I just put it down." He had a nightmare, though she didn't know about it until he told her 3 weeks into the second commission, on an evening when she had stayed late working and he had brought 2 glasses of wine, sat across from her, and said without preamble, "I had a dream about the accident. I haven't had one in several months." She set down her brush. She looked at him. "Do you want to talk about it?" she said. "You don't have to. I've been told I should talk about these things," he said, with a wryness that was new, that had developed over the weeks, a very dry, very contained form of irony that she had come to find one of the most compelling things about him. "I have not generally found the telling useful. And yet," she said, echoing his word back at him. A pause. He took a drink of wine. "The dream is always the same," he said. "She calls. I don't answer." He looked at the glass. "She called me that evening, on the drive. I was in a meeting I considered important." He stopped. "It wasn't important." She sat with that. "You would have answered," she said, "if you had known." Of course. The not answering wasn't negligence. It was a Tuesday. She paused. The most forgettable day of the week. Things like that don't get warnings. He looked at her. "Is this what you do?" he said. "With other people in this situation?" "I've been in this situation," she said. "Not the same way. But I've had the call I missed after. I know what it's like to replay the 10 minutes before." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "Your mother." "My mother," she said. "She called 3 days before she died to tell me she was coming to the city for a visit. I was in the middle of preparing for a show. I said I'd call her back. She called again 2 days later, and I missed it. She died the next morning." She picked up her wine glass. "The show did well." She said it with the flat honesty she always brought to it, because she had had 7 years to look at it and understand that the flat honesty was the only way to carry it without it crushing her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," she said. They were quiet together. Not the silence of 2 people with nothing to say, but the silence of 2 people who have said enough, who understand each other's specific geography of loss without needing to map it all out. She looked at the painting of Sophia taking shape on the canvas and thought about how much a portrait was always, in some way, about the person doing the painting. What you chose to see, what you reached toward, the capacity for attention, which was another word for love. "It gets different," she said finally. "I want you to know that. Not better, exactly, but different. The replaying stops, eventually. Not because you decide to stop. It just stops on its own, when you've been kind to yourself long enough." "I have not been kind to myself," he said, and the admission was so simple and so direct and so different from everything he had previously given her that she felt it like a physical thing. "I know," she said. "You can start." He looked at her. "Just like that." "Not just like that," she said. "Like that, and then again, and again, and again. It's practice, not a decision." He looked at the painting, then at her. "You are," he started, and stopped. "What?" He shook his head slightly, the way someone does when they've tried to find words for something and found the words insufficient. "Remarkable," he said finally, which she suspected was not the word he'd reached for first. She didn't answer. She picked up her brush and went back to the painting, and he sat in his chair with his wine and watched her work, and the room was full of a particular quality of warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace being lit, which it was, but had to do with 2 people choosing to be honest with each other in the same space, which was rarer. It was on one of the late evenings, the second week of February, the painting 4 days from finished, that she told him something she had not planned to tell him. He had asked, after dinner, in the offhand way he had begun to ask personal questions, carefully, with room to retreat from the answer if she offered it. Whether she had been in love before. Not with whom. Whether. She considered lying. Not from fear, but from habit. She was private about herself, more private than her manner suggested, and her personal history was the part of herself she gave away least freely. But she had spent 4 months asking him to give her things, and it seemed wrong, at this point, to hold herself separate. Once, she said, seriously. A few times before that in ways I thought were serious and weren't. What happened to the serious one? He was also an artist. She looked at her wine glass. We were very alike in the specific ways that make two people feel like they've been understood, and very unlike in the ways that actually matter for living with someone. He needed to be the primary version of everything. The primary artist in any room, the primary problem, the primary concern. He wasn't unkind about it. He just required a lot of space, and I require a lot of space, and we didn't fit. How long ago? 5 years. We were together 3 years. It ended. She thought about it. Correctly. The way things end that were never quite right. Mutually and honestly, and without drama. She paused. I painted 3 of my best portraits the year after. Misery, I have come to believe, is less productive for me than clarity. He was quiet for a moment. You've been alone since then. By choice. Not always easily. She looked at him. I'm not someone who needs company. But I do, occasionally, find that I've been alone too long and the solitude has changed from restful to something else. Something else, he said. Like what? She looked at her glass. Like an echo chamber. When you spend too much time only in your own head, your own thoughts start to sound like facts instead of thoughts. She searched for it. You need someone who pushes back, who sees you from outside. He was quiet. Then, I have not had that, I think, since Sophia. He paused. I have people around me constantly. Men whose job is to tell me what I want to hear, which is a form of loneliness I hadn't anticipated. And Matteo? Matteo tells me the truth from Rome, occasionally, in ways that are true but not particularly useful. He is good at identifying what I'm doing wrong. He is less good at, he stopped. He does not have the temperament for patience. He has always wanted me to be finished. With the family. With the responsibility. He has never quite accepted that I am not capable of simply putting it down. Sophia accepted it. Sophia accepted everything about me and then asked me to be better anyway. He looked at the painting above the fireplace. Her portrait was up now, though not finished, as a placeholder while he waited. That's the specific talent she had. She didn't ask me to be different. She asked me to be more fully myself. Elara looked at the painting too. Sophia laughing. Sophia entirely present. She sounds like someone who knew exactly what she was doing, she said. She did, he said. Always. She finished Sophia's portrait on a Saturday in early February, at 2 in the afternoon, and she sat with it for a long time before she told him. It was the best thing she had ever painted. She knew it the way she had known the first portrait was the best of a particular kind, and this was the best of a different kind. Not the same formal achievement, but a different emotional achievement. The painting showed a woman laughing, alive, specific, not generic or idealized or softened. It showed the woman who had planted the roses and sung off-key in the kitchen and put a color in her head and lived as if there would be time to get to it. It showed a woman who had been loved completely and had loved back. She called Dante in. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he came into the room. She moved aside from the canvas and gave him the space to look, and then she went to the window and looked at the garden, because the moment was not hers and she understood that. He stood there for a long time. She counted in her head again, but she lost count somewhere around 90 seconds, when she heard something she had never heard from him before, a sound so quiet she wasn't certain she heard it, a small unguarded sound, the kind that escapes when a person's discipline finally yields to something larger. She didn't turn. She kept looking at the garden. The roses were still bare, still waiting, still holding the promise of May. After a while he came to stand beside her, also looking at the garden. They stood next to each other, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. It's her, he said. His voice was different, still controlled, but with the control of a man who has allowed himself to feel something and is simply managing it rather than suppressing it, which was different. How did you? You told me who she was, she said. I just listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very softly, Thank you, Elara. She turned to look at him then, and found him already looking at her. And what was in his face was not the 2-second flash she'd been seeing for months, but the sustained, open thing. The man he actually was, present and undefended, all of it there at once. The grief, the weight, the capacity for love that had not gone anywhere despite everything. And underneath all of it, something that had been building quietly over 8 weeks and 3 weeks more, and that she recognized because she was carrying the same thing. You're welcome, she said. His hand moved from his side, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who does nothing without having decided to do it, and found hers. Not a grip, Just contact. His thumb moved once across her knuckles. The way you touch something you are not sure is real and are trying to confirm. I don't know how to do this, he said, very quietly. I should tell you that. I don't. It's been a long time since I allowed myself to want anything that wasn't about the work or the... He stopped. I'm out of practice with wanting things for myself. I know, she said. I'm also, he said, a complicated man. In the ways you know about, and in ways you'd learn later. I'm not simple. Neither am I, she said. I'm a painter who lives in Bushwick and takes 8 weeks to understand her subjects and still hasn't figured out what she's doing with her life in any conventional sense. I'm not simple either. He looked at her, the ghost of that almost smile again, but sustained this time, more real than she'd seen it. I want to take you to dinner, he said. Not here, with Johnny's wife's cooking, which is excellent, but somewhere, outside. Somewhere with a reservation and a table and people who aren't employed by me. He paused. If that's something you want. She looked at their hands. Yes, she said. That's something I want. The roses came back in May, as they always did. She was there to see it, which she wouldn't have been able to predict from the Tuesday in November when she'd first walked into the townhouse with her portfolio bag and her conditions and her unconscious habit of paying too much attention to things. She was there because she had come to be there often, not as a painter, or not only as a painter, but as someone who had been let in through the gates that most people couldn't see, let alone open. She was in the garden when the first ones opened, sitting in one of the iron chairs near Sophia's beds with her sketchbook, because she was always drawing, and Dante was inside taking a call from Johnny that had something to do with something she had decided not to ask about. Some things were not hers to know, and she had made peace with that. She was not naive about the life he led, and he had not pretended it was simpler than it was. They had had a specific and honest conversation about it on the 4th date, at a restaurant in the West Village where no one had recognized him, or had recognized him and decided to act otherwise. She had told him, I can be with someone who lives in a complicated world. I can't be with someone who lies to me about it. He had told her, I don't lie to the people I trust. I haven't trusted anyone in a long time, but I'm capable of it. She had decided to believe him, which was an act of faith rather than certainty, which she understood was what love always was. In March he had taken her to Rome. She had not expected it, had not pressed for it, knowing what the city meant and not wanting to reach towards something he wasn't ready to offer. He had planned it himself, quietly, and told her at dinner one evening in February, I think it's time, and I'd like to go with you, if you're willing. They had stayed 4 days. She had sketched obsessively, the Forum at dawn, the light on the Tiber in the late afternoon, the particular texture of travertine. He had taken her to the Borghese Gallery, where she had stood in front of Bernini's Apollo and Daphne for 20 minutes without speaking, and he had stood beside her, also not speaking, and she had known from that specific silence that he understood what she was seeing, not just the technical achievement, extraordinary as it was, but the thing it was about. Transformation at the moment of crisis, beauty and loss at the exact same instant, indistinguishable from each other. On the 3rd day, he had taken her to the shop in Trastevere. He had found it again, somehow, with the precision he applied to everything, and they had stood in front of a wall of paint colors while he found the specific one Sophia had wanted for the kitchen. A deep, warm terracotta, the color of old Roman walls, the color of something that has been standing in the sun for centuries. I'm going to paint the kitchen, he said. She looked at the color chip in his hand. Good, she said. Will you help me? She laughed. I paint portraits. I'm not a house painter. You can make sure I do it right, he said. And there it was, the smile, real this time, fully arrived, the whole face participating, and she understood that she was the only person who had seen him smile in a very long time, and that she would spend as long as she could making sure the sight of it was not unusual. Yes, she said. I'll help you do it right. They painted the kitchen in April, on a weekend, badly and slowly, and with considerable argument about technique, and too much paint on the drop cloth, and Dante in a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, which was an image she was going to carry for the rest of her life. The terracotta color was exactly right. They both knew at the moment it was on the wall. He put the portrait of Sophia above the fireplace in the study, where the other one had been. He put his own portrait in the room where she had painted it, in the 3rd-floor space that looked over the garden, where the winter light fell in clean and gray and honest through the north-facing window. He had looked at both of them on the day they were hung, and he had not said anything for a while, And then he had said, quietly, to himself more than to her, "Thank you, mi amore." And she had understood that he was not talking to her. She had turned away to give him the moment. She was good at knowing when a moment was not hers and when to make room for it. Now she sat in the garden in May with her sketchbook while the first roses opened in the beds Sophia had planted. Pink ones, deep-centered, the kind that smell like something from another century. She drew them quickly, loosely, not the tight architectural drawings she made when she was studying a subject, but the free kind, the kind that was just her hand moving because her hand always needed to be moving. The door opened behind her, and she heard his footsteps on the stone. He sat in the other iron chair. She didn't look up. She heard the quiet sound of him setting his coffee down on the table between them. "The call was about Chicago," he said. "Johnny has it in hand." "Good," she said, not asking more than that. He was quiet. She kept drawing. After a while he leaned slightly toward her and looked at what she was drawing, which was not the roses but his hands. She had drawn his hands so many times now that she could do it from memory, which said something about the specific attentiveness of painters toward their subjects. "You're drawing my hands," he said. "Your hands are interesting. You've said that before. It keeps being true." He settled back in his chair and looked at the roses. She added a shadow to the knuckle of the index finger on the page, a detail she'd been missing in other versions. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked up. He was looking at the roses, not at her, in the way he used to do everything, with his profile to her, giving himself somewhere else to put his gaze. But she had learned now that this was not evasion. It was simply how he gathered himself for things that mattered. "I want to know if you're happy," he said. "Here. With this. He made a gesture that encompassed the garden and himself, and by extension, everything that came with him. "I want to know that it's what you want. Not a compromise." She set her sketchbook down on her knee and looked at him. He turned then, meeting her gaze. "What made you ask?" she said. "I've been thinking about it," he said. "I spent a long time not thinking about other people's happiness, including my own. I'm trying to correct that." She looked at his face. The face she had painted, knew, had been paying attention to for months. The bones of it, the light on it, the way it had opened incrementally from the inside like a window in a room that has been dark too long. The grief was still there. It would always be there, and she had stopped expecting it to disappear, had stopped thinking of it as an obstacle. It was part of him. Sophia was part of him. That was not something to compete with or diminish. It was something to make room for, which was different. "I am," she said, genuinely. "I'm not happy in a way that ignores the difficult parts. I know your life is complicated, and I know there are things I'm choosing not to know because they're not mine to know, and I know this is not the simple life I could have had with someone who has an office job and no history." She looked at the roses. "But I've never been interested in simple. I'm interested in real. And this is real." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across and took her hand from her lap. Not quickly, not impulsively, but in the careful, deliberate way he did everything that mattered to him. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, the same gesture as the first time, which had become their shorthand for something that didn't have a word. "Yes," she said, before he could speak. "Whatever you were going to say, yes." He raised an eyebrow. The one eyebrow, slightly, in the way she'd learned was him being amused. "You don't know what I was going to say." "No," she said, "but I've been paying very close attention to you for months, and I can usually tell." He looked at her. Then he said, quietly, with the specific economy he used for the things that cost him the most, "I love you." "That's what I was going to say." She looked at him. The man in the garden with his coffee and his scar-marked hands, and the weight he was still learning to carry differently, and the capacity for love that had never been the problem, had never been diminished or damaged, only sealed. Now unsealed. Now present. "I know," she said. "I've seen it for a while." "In the painting?" he said. "In the garden," she said. "In November. When you talked about the dog." He looked at the roses for a moment, and she watched the corner of his mouth and the line of his jaw and the particular quality of light in his eyes, which she had spent months learning to read the way she read light everywhere, not by what it illuminated, but by how it fell, and where, and what it meant. "I love you too," she said. In case that wasn't clear. "It was becoming clear," he said. "I wanted to be certain." "You can be certain," she said. He squeezed her hand once. She went back to her sketchbook. He went back to looking at the roses, which Sophia had planted, which the gardener had kept, which had come back, as they did, because that is what roses do. That is what living things do. They come back. Cold Brushstrokes is a work of fiction. The Carullo family, the 5 families as depicted herein, and all characters are invented. The townhouse on East 73rd Street does not exist. The Trastevere paint shop may or may not exist. There are many such shops, and many such colors, and many such things that people mean to get to. The technique of painting described in this novel, the use of a warm ground, the layering of transparent glazes, the working from life rather than reference, reflects traditional oil portraiture methods, particularly those of the 17th century Dutch and Flemish masters who understood that a portrait is not a likeness but a reckoning. The grief in this novel is real, in the way that invented grief is real, assembled from the texture of actual grief, which is always larger and more patient and more structural than we expect, and which does not, as it turns out, go anywhere until we decide to give it somewhere to go. For everyone who kept the garden,